Last video we scheduled the closing, but maybe you don't know how to make these last few days before closing flawless for the client. Let me help you perfect this time leading up to the closing. As a real estate processing manager, the real estate transaction or the deal is assigned to me once there is an accepted offer and all contract paperwork has been executed. In the last 4 years, I have successfully managed over 1,100 real estate transactions to closing. In the first video of this series, I gave you the 5 stages of managing a real estate transaction. These have helped me and many others get deals to the closing table. In my last video, I talked about the tasks and strategies for what I call almost to the finish line stage. That stage covered reviewing the title commitment and initiating conversations to clear objections if needed, communicating with the buyer's lender for the final appraisal results and the clear to close, receipt of completed work invoices if there were repairs to be done, staging removal, and finally scheduling the closing day. Today I'm breaking down stage 4, it's closing day. This stage is likely the most exciting stage and reflects the diligent work that has been done to get us here. These steps have happened over the next few days immediately preceding the closing day. So we have the closing day scheduled, now what? Task 1 is utility transfers. This is not something that I do, but rather I gather the information and provide that information to our client so that they can transfer the utilities. If our client is the seller, I will ask them to provide a list of their utility providers that I will pass on to the buyer's agent. And then I will direct them to contact their utility providers and schedule a final reading for the day of the closing. If our client is the buyer, I will reach out to the listing agent and ask for a list of the utility providers from their seller. Then I will direct our buyer to contact those utility providers and make application to transfer service into their name on the closing day. Well, I've got a story. I've got lots of stories actually, but this one is appropriate since we're talking about utilities now. I was actually an escrow closer at a title insurance company, and I had a late closing appointment scheduled one afternoon. However, the lender was on Eastern time, which meant that the transaction couldn't disperse or fund until the next day when they reopened. They needed to review and sign off on the closing conditions. This was in a time before wire transfers were even a thing. So the buyers had done their walkthrough the morning of the closing, but everyone knew that they were going to have to return the following morning to sign the disbursement authorization so that the buyers could get their keys and the checks were released. Anyway, long story short, the seller was a relocation company, and the real estate broker had handled all of the utility transfers for them. Well, guess what? Somehow a utility shutoff happened, not a utility transfer. So the electric company had gone out that Thursday afternoon after the buyers had done a walkthrough and shut off the electrical service. And of course, we can all finish the story. A huge storm blew through that night, and with no electric, that meant no sump pump. And yep, the basement flooded. And when did everyone find out about that? When the buyers got their keys the next morning and went over to start moving in. So, moral of the story, make sure your seller is scheduling utility transfers and your buyer is signing up for transfer of service into their name on the closing day. That way, this utility transfer happens seamlessly and without interruption. The next event for the days leading up to the closing is the final walkthrough. Now, in my area, the buyer's agent coordinates a time with the buyers directly and schedules this through showing time. And I've talked about showing time in earlier videos. I'm not usually involved in the walkthrough at all, but this could be different in your area. And it absolutely, positively is a necessary task to happen before closing, usually the day before or the same day of closing. Another task is the removal of the signs and key boxes. This is going to be dependent on your arrangement for managing real estate transactions. You may need to make arrangements to have those pulled or communicate with your real estate agent to make sure he is removing those. Signs and key boxes are very expensive, and they need to be pulled before the closing so they can go back into the broker's inventory rather than getting lost in the shuffle. Now we are just a day or two before the actual closing date, and the title company or escrow agent should have gathered everything they need to put together a closing statement for review. Again, in my area of business, the title company balances the closing disclosure with the buyer's lender, but they do issue a closing statement for the selling agent and the listing agent to review ahead of the closing. I start asking the title company for this at least 2 days in advance of the actual closing date. I compare the closing statement to the purchase agreement and all of the other documentation I have in my file for this transaction. Closing day is an exciting day for buyers and sellers alike. So the last thing I ever want to do is have something blow up at the closing table that I could have avoided. It has always been my mission to double check the closing statement to make sure that all of the figures are included and accurate. Before I took on the processing manager role, my supervisor had told me that they would have Friday after Friday, they did most of their closings on Fridays, full of fires to put out at the closing table. Now I understand that there can be difficulties at the closing table, but trust me when I say that once I implemented my strategy of reviewing the closing statement ahead of time using my digital product, the reasons for a fire were definitely not because of mistakes on the closing statement. I encourage you to grab my free ebook below the video description on the stages of managing a real estate transaction. And also subscribe to my channel so you are part of notifications for the new videos I release and some digital products that will make the closing statement review and other parts of this process so much easier for you. Okay, so I reviewed the closing statement and it all looks great. I now forward the closing statement to our client along with any corresponding paperwork. Perhaps if our client is the seller, I would forward them their mortgage payoff letter. If our client was the buyer and there was a homeowners association, I might send them the HOA letter. In this email, I also provide final closing details, time, address, and phone number of the closing agent. And if they are the buyer, I remind them to wire their funds to be received on or before the morning of closing. I also remind all parties they need to bring valid photo ID. This is a must. So wow, we've worked with our client from the beginning, and now we are handing them off to the closing. Trust me, not nearly as painful as sending your firstborn off to college, but I have one more stage which covered just a few admin tasks to close this file out. So I'll finish off the 5 stages of managing a real estate transaction tomorrow, concluding with stage 5, made it to the finish line.